But for now, we're going to show you a digital story which lasts about 20 minutes and focuses on 18 of Gloucester's lost schools. It's going to tell you a little bit more about the history of each one, and it's illustrated with images of relevant material in the archives and a few photos of what the sites look like today. And this digital story is based on a walk which was first launched at the Gloucester History Festival in 2019. If you'd like to do the walk yourself and visit the various sites in person, we've produced a map with directions.
Let's take a look at some of the lost schools that used to exist in Gloucester city centre. We're going to start with Kingsholm School, which is on Alvin Street. The school opened on the 11th of October 1926 as an infant school and a mixed school for older children up to the age of 14. In 1931, the city schools were reorganised and Kingsholm became Kingsholm Senior Girls' School and Kingsholm Infant School, the juniors transferring elsewhere and the senior boys going to Archdeacon Street, which we'll take a look at in a minute. The infant school continued in the eastern half of the building, the western half being occupied by the senior school, later the secondary modern school, until its closure in 1962. The secondary girls transferred to the new Winifred Cullis School in Barnwood in 1957, which later became Barnwood Park. And on the closure of Kingsholm Infant School in 1962, the boys' senior school expanded into the former infants part of the premises. Kingsholm Secondary School closed eventually in 1973, and the pupils transferred gradually to St Bridge School, which is now Gloucester Academy. The site and buildings were transferred to the County Council along with the rest of the City Education Service when local government was reorganised in 1974, and the buildings were used as a teachers' centre for a few years. In 1979, the Gloucestershire Record Office moved in, having outgrown its previous accommodation, and remains there today as the Gloucestershire Heritage Hub. Now we'll move on to St Catherine's School, which stood on the corner of Priory Road and St Oswald's Road. And a national school was opened in about 1835 to the north of the old St Catherine's Church, which stood on the site alongside what is now Gowder Way and incorporated some of the ruins of the old priory there. The school seems to have functioned in its early days as the Girls and Infants Department of London Road National School, and it was known as Gloucester Girls National School. It later became known as St Catherine's School and served the parishes of St Catherine and St Mary de Lode until 1868, when St Mary de Lode School was opened on Mount Street, and the two schools had a lot of connections throughout their history. In 1876, a new building was opened to the west of the new St Catherine's Church, which had been built on the site of the old one in 1869, and the school still catered for girls and infants. St Mary de Lode School closed in 1901, and the nursery department of St Catherine's School used the building from 1901 to 1907, when the Board of Education ordered that this building be closed and the nursery department returned to the main school. The former St Mary de Lode buildings were improved, and in 1910 the whole infants department of St Catherine's School transferred there, and we'll talk a little bit more about Mount Street School in a few minutes. St Catherine's operated as a girls' school for pupils aged 7 to 14 until the general reorganisation of city schools in 1931, when St Catherine's became a junior girls' school for pupils aged 7 to 11. The older girls transferred mainly to Kingsholm Senior School. In 1938, the top class from Mount Street Infant School was transferred back to the St Catherine's building. So there was a lot of toing and froing between Mount Street and St Catherine's in the middle 20th century, as you can tell. By 1952, although St Catherine's was a girls' school, boys aged 6 were also admitted from Mount Street on the Archdeacon Street Infant School and allowed to stay for 2 years because there were dangerous roads between their homes and other schools. And road safety on school routes was a concern for both parents and the City Council during the 1950s and 1960s as more motor traffic began to appear on the city's roads. In 1955, the infant school closed and St Catherine's became a primary school, taking children aged between 3 and 11. However, the buildings were ageing and local pressure for a new school on an adjacent site was unsuccessful. The new Kingsholm Church of England Junior School opened in 1962, and the junior girls transferred there, and then in 1973 the Kingsholm School was enlarged to take infants and St Catherine's closed completely. Now we'll move on to Mount Street School, which is on the corner of St Oswald's Road and Mount Street. St Mary de Lode National School opened in 1868 as a girls' and infants school and closed in 1901, the pupils transferring to the nearby St Catherine's School. And as we've already heard, the nursery department of St Catherine's used the building between 1902 and 1907, although it had to move back to St Catherine's when the Board of Education decreed the buildings unsuitable. After some renovation works, Mount Street Temporary Infant School was opened in the former St Mary de Lode School buildings in January 1910, taking the whole infants department of St Catherine's. However, although it was intended to be temporary, the school remained open until 1955. The building was flooded by the River Severn in March 1947, as you can see from the photograph we've got here. In September 1948, the school transferred to 3 rooms of the buildings formerly occupied by Archdeacon Street Senior School, which we'll talk about more in a few moments, and became known as Archdeacon Street Infant School. The school closed permanently in 1955. The buildings in Mount Street were sold in 1958 and at first were used as a commercial store until the site was required for the road development scheme widening Priory Road and creating St Oswald's Road. And then some houses were built on the site in about the 1980s. Moving on to Archdeacon Street School, Deacon Street Board School opened in 1899, replacing the endowed free school or poor school. It catered for boys and infants at the beginning, although in December 1899 the infants were transferred to St Nicholas National School. Evening continuation classes, which were intended for men and older boys who had left school, were provided from 1899. The City Education Committee took over the school in 1903 following the Education Act of 1902 and provided new school buildings in 1910 and 1911. The school's name was changed to Archdeacon Street School in 1911, reflecting the change in street name from Deacon Street to Archdeacon Street, which presumably took place around the same time. In September 1931, the city schools were reorganised, and Archdeacon Street School became a senior boys' school for pupils aged 11 to 14. In September 1939, Archdeacon Street Senior Boys' School and Kingsholm Senior Girls' School amalgamated to form Kingsholm Senior Mixed School, using the Kingsholm buildings in Alvin Street. The Archdeacon Street premises were used for a short time by the art and technical colleges as a junior technical school, and then they were requisitioned during the Second World War. In 1948, the pupils from Mount Street Infant School were transferred to part of the Archdeacon Street buildings, as we've heard, becoming known as Archdeacon Street Primary Infant School. This school closed in 1955. Between 1949 and 1963, part of the Archdeacon Street premises were used as a special school, known as Archdeacon Street Junior School. The pupils were transferred to Longford School when it expanded to take junior children as well as secondary age pupils in 1963. Following the closure of the special school, the premises were used for various educational purposes, including as a teachers' centre and an annex of the College of Technology. Ownership of the premises passed with the rest of the City Education Service to Gloucestershire County Council on local government reorganisation in 1974, and it was used for some time as a staff training centre, and this is one of the very few of these lost schools whose buildings still survive today. We'll move on now to St Nicholas School, which stood at the corner of Upper Quay Street and Quay Street. Now, St Nicholas Infant School was established in December 1830 and a new building was provided for it on the corner of Castle Lane and Bearland in 1833. Around 1870, the school began to take older girls as well as infants, and in 1872 a new building was opened almost opposite the old school at the junction of Quay Street and what was then called Upper Quay Lane. It had accommodation for boys, girls and infants departments, but the boys department closed temporarily between 1875 and 1877 due to lack of funds and closed permanently in 1898. The boys mainly transferred to Deacon Street School, which later became known as Archdeacon Street School. The City Education Committee took over the school in 1903 following the Education Act of 1902, and by the 1920s the buildings were considered unsuitable for older children. The girls over 11 were transferred to St Catherine's School in 1926. When the city schools were reorganised in 1931, the junior girls also transferred elsewhere, and St Nicholas became an infant school. However, it closed in 1933, and the buildings were demolished in 1937 to make way for the CWS Creamery. Later, the site was used as a car park for many years, and is now occupied by student accommodation. Now we will move on to Barrack Square, where the Domestic Science College was for a long time. This was a college for training teachers of domestic science, the Gloucestershire School of Cookery and Domestic Economy. It opened in 1891 in part of the old gas company offices in Quay Street and moved to the old barracks in 1894. It was renamed the Gloucestershire School of Domestic Science in 1900 and was run by a subcommittee of the County Council's Education Committee. In 1925, the school was renamed the Gloucestershire Training College of Domestic Science, and in 1958 the college moved to new buildings at Oxstalls. From 1962 it provided general teacher training and was renamed the Gloucestershire College of Education in 1967. It closed in 1980 and the Gloucestershire College of Art and Technology, or GLOSCAT, used the Oxstalls buildings for some years. Eventually, though, the Oxstalls site became part of the campus of the University of Gloucestershire. Also in the barracks was the Gloucester Dairy School, which opened in 1889, initially in a building in Station Road, and had moved to the barracks by 1899. The County Council had taken it over by 1906, and they ran it as the Gloucestershire County Dairy School until the late 1920s. We'll move on to the Crypt School, which has had 4 sites over its history. Now, originally it stood in Southgate Street. The Crypt School was founded by the will of John Cook, who was a mercer who died in 1528. He'd been twice High Sheriff of the city of Gloucester in 1494 and 1498, and 4 times Mayor of the city in 1501, 1507, 1512 and 1519. His will was carried out by his widow and sole executrix, whose name was Joan, and a schoolroom was built next to St Mary de Crypt Church in Southgate Street. It's known to have been operating by 1539, and that building is still there today. In 1861, the school moved to new buildings in Barton Street, having been closed for 4 years. It moved again to Friars Orchard in Brunswick Road in 1887, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. Notable old Cryptians who attended the school while it was in Southgate Street and Barton Street include George Whitfield, who attended 1726 to 1731, John Moore, Archbishop of Canterbury, who attended 1739 to 1744, Robert Raikes, who attended in the 1730s to 1740s, although his exact dates at the school are not known, John Lightfoot, the botanist, who attended in the 1740s to 1750s, and W. E. Henley, the poet, playwright and critic, who attended 1861 to 1867. Now, the Crypt School moved to Friars Orchard on Brunswick Road in 1887. By the 1930s, the school was becoming very overcrowded, and this, together with the construction of the new technical college, which later became known as Gloucestershire College of Art and Technology, or GLOSCAT, and then Gloucestershire College, on the Friars Orchard site, and this prompted a move to new buildings in Podsmead. The foundation stone was laid by the Duchess of Gloucester in 1939, and in 1943 the new buildings were opened to pupils, the war having considerably hampered their construction. Delays were also caused by problems with the architect, which eventually resulted in a pair of court cases. Notable old Cryptians who attended the school while it was at Friars Orchard include Harold Costley White, Dean of Gloucester, who attended 1886 to 1888, H.D.F. Kitto, the classicist, who attended 1909 to 1916, R.G. Austin, another classicist, who attended 1909 to 1918, and Brian Chapman Frith, MBE FSG, local historian, who attended 1923 to 1934, and while at the school masterminded an archaeological dig at the front corner of the site to find part of the city wall. The prominent archaeologist Sir Mortimer Wheeler visited the dig. Now we come to the technical and art colleges. A School of Art opened at Bearland House in 1859, and evening classes in science began in the city in 1867, and they later moved with the art classes to the new Schools of Science and Art in Brunswick Road, which opened in 1872. The corporation took over the schools in 1896. In 1906, they passed to the United Schools Governors, who also ran the city secondary schools, the Crypt Grammar School, Sir Thomas Richards, and Denmark Road, the High School for Girls. In 1933, the United Schools and Colleges passed back to the City Education Authority. The Science School became known as the Technical School and then the Technical College during the first decades of the 20th century. In 1941, the Technical College moved to new buildings on the Friars Orchard site formerly occupied by the Crypt School, although the school's original buildings remained standing behind the new college building until the 1960s, when they were demolished to make way for the college extension and tower block, which were opened in 1967 and 1974. The art school was renamed the College of Art in 1952, and in 1968 it moved into new buildings on the east side of Brunswick Road. The College of Art merged with the Art College at Cheltenham to form the Gloucestershire College of Art and Design in 1968, and in 1981 the Art and Technical Colleges merged to form the Gloucestershire College of Arts and Technology, otherwise known as GLOSCAT, which is now Gloucestershire College. Both sets of buildings on either side of Brunswick Road have recently been demolished and replaced with flats after the college moved to its new building at Lanthony. But you can see the old door from the Technical College on the front of one of the new blocks of flats on Brunswick Road. Meanwhile, the original schools of science and art are now used by Gloucester City Library and the Gloucester Museum. Moving a little further down Brunswick Road, when we come to the corner of Brunswick Road and Park Road, this was the site of Christchurch School, which opened in around 1831 as a charity school for girls and infants run by the Vicar of Christchurch, originally in premises in Barton Street. New buildings were built at the junction of what is now Brunswick Road and Park Road in about 1839. The school became a national school in 1847. Following the Education Act of 1902, the City Education Committee took over responsibility for Christchurch School, except for building repairs and alterations, and in 1907 the school's name was changed from Christchurch National School to Christchurch Church of England School. When the city schools were reorganised in 1931, Christchurch became an infant school. The school closed in July 1958 due to the outdated buildings and a decline in the child population in the city centre and consequent fall in pupil numbers. The buildings were used by Sir Thomas Rich's School and the College of Art for a while, but they were eventually demolished in 1971. Now, the British School was opened in Wellington Street in 1841 and was run along the lines of the British and Foreign Schools Society, which was non-denominational, as opposed to the National Society, which was Church of England. The school managers handed the British School over to the Gloucester School Board in 1900 owing to financial difficulties which prevented them from being able to provide additional accommodation to ease the overcrowding in the school, and the board closed the infants department, which helped with the overcrowding. In 1903 the school transferred to the City Education Committee, following the Education Act of 1902, and the City Authority changed the school's name to Wellington Street School in 1905. In 1931 the city schools were reorganised and Wellington Street closed. The buildings were used for some time by the Health Visitors Service for handing out milk tokens to mothers who needed them, and they were later used by Sir Thomas Rich's School, which was next door. The school buildings were demolished in the 1960s, presumably after Sir Thomas Rich's School moved out to their new site at Elmbridge. Now, Sir Thomas Rich's School was founded under the will of Sir Thomas Rich in 1666, and it opened in Sir Thomas's former house in Eastgate Street in 1668. It was known as the Blue Coat School, as Sir Thomas's will stipulated that the boys should wear blue coats and caps, as at Christ's Hospital in London. The municipal charity trustees took over the finances of the school from Gloucester Corporation in the late 1830s, and in 1882 the governors of Gloucester United Schools were established to run Sir Thomas Rich's, Crypt, and a new secondary school for girls, which eventually became the High School for Girls at Denmark Road. And the school's name was officially changed from the Blue Coat School to Sir Thomas Rich's School, although, of course, in the city it is known almost exclusively as Tommy Rich's. The Crypt provided grammar school education, and Sir Thomas Rich's catered for the non-grammar school boys. The school moved to the former Crypt School building in Barton Street in 1889, and the Guildhall was built on the old site. In 1945, following the Education Act of 1944, Sir Thomas Rich's became an 11 to 18 local authority grammar school, and the junior pupils transferred elsewhere. A new site for the school was purchased at Elmbridge in 1947, but for various reasons the new premises were not opened until 1964. Once the school moved to Elmbridge, the site and buildings in Barton Street were used by the Education Department of the City Council for some years. Now, St Michael's National School opened in May 1848 on a site on Russell Street, opposite the end of Bedford Street. And the school catered for infants and girls, boys going to London Road National School, which we'll hear about in a moment. And it took pupils up to school leaving age. In 1931, the city schools were reorganised, and St Michael's became a junior girls and infants school, taking 4 to 11-year-olds. In 1938, the former Jewish burial ground in Eastgate Street was purchased as an extension to the playground, the graves being moved to Treadworth Cemetery. The Jewish community in Gloucester had moved to Cheltenham during the 19th century. St Michael's School closed in July 1962, and the juniors transferred to the new Kingsholm Church of England Junior School. The school buildings were leased out and were still standing in 1997, although they have since been demolished and replaced with housing. Now, St Aldate's School stood in St Aldate's Square. It opened in 1869 as St Aldate's National School and replaced a parish school which had been held in a cottage in St Aldate Square, which was just off St Aldate Street, and the backyard of what was until very recently the Debenhams department store is more or less on the site of St Aldate Square now. The new building was in the form of a parallelogram, and it stood on the southwestern side of the church across from the graveyard. The school appears to have mostly taken girls and infants, with a few young junior boys who then moved on to London Road National School. The school closed between 1885 and 1888, and the buildings were used for Sunday school and parish purposes. The site was sold to the Bon Marche in 1932, the proceeds being used to establish a charity for educational purposes in the parishes of St Aldate and St John. The church was demolished in 1963, having closed in the 1930s and been used as a parish room in the intervening period, and eventually the Bon Marche was extended and turned into Debenhams. Now, London Road National School stood between the railway and Great Western Road, more or less where the modern block where the pharmacy is today, and it opened in March 1817, the foundation stone having been laid by the Duke of Wellington in July 1816. In about 1835, the girls and infants moved to St Catherine's School in Priory Road, and the London Road School took boys only. As part of the reorganisation of the city schools in 1931, the senior pupils transferred elsewhere, and the school became London Road Junior Boys' School. The school closed in July 1962, and the pupils transferred to the new King's Home Church of England Junior School. The site frontage was sold to Gloucester Corporation for the widening of London Road, and the rest of the site was sold for development. Now, St John's National School opened in 1847 on Worcester Street in a former nonconformist chapel on the western side of Worcester Street. It took girls and infants, probably mostly girls. By 1870, St John's was also operating a boys' national school in Black Dog Yard. The Worcester Street buildings were not considered suitable as a school by the late 1870s and closed in 1877. The school in Black Dog Yard, more or less where the traffic lights with the junction of London Road and Black Dog Way, appears to have continued as a boys' and girls' school for some years, as it appears on the first edition Ordnance Survey map in 1883. But by 1885 there was apparently no school in existence for the parish of St John. And because these two schools closed so very early, we don't have any records of them. We only have a few mentions, and they appear on a couple of maps. The Worcester Street building was sold in 1933, and the site is now occupied by a letting agent's shop. And although I'm not certain, I think it's still the same building, because it's exactly the same shape as it was on the Board of Health map from the 1850s, which shows the school. Now we move on to St Peter's Roman Catholic School. The first parish school for Roman Catholic children in Gloucester was founded in 1835 in a loft above the sacristy of St Peter's Church. It later moved to premises near the Black Dog Inn, and in 1851 to larger premises in Northgate Street. In the early 1860s, a new St Peter's Church and School were built, and the school opened in 1864 next to the church in London Road. The school was reorganised into separate mixed and infant departments in 1893, and it was the only school in Gloucester to remain an all-age school when the city schools were reorganised in 1931. Following the Education Act 1944, which required the division of all-age schools into separate primary and secondary schools, a new infant school was opened for St Peter's on a site at Horton Road in 1953. A new junior school opened on the same site in 1957, and the London Road site became a secondary modern school. New premises were provided for the secondary modern school at a site on Stroud Road in Tuffley, opening in 1964, and this is still St Peter's High School today. The former school building, meanwhile, is now used as a church hall by St Peter's Church. It's the two-storey building that you can see at the back of the church. And that is another of the very few buildings that still exist.